name, your land, your language, but not your legacy. Reclaim it at AfricanAncestry.com.
For viewers unfamiliar with your work, right, especially your tours inspired by Egypt on the Potomac, can you explain the connection between Kemet, Freemasonry, and the layout and symbolism embedded in Washington, D.C.?
So because of the fact that I was born in Chicago, Chicago is the home of architecture. The first skyscraper in the world was built in Chicago. Chicago has some of the greatest architecture in the world. I had aspirations of being an architect. I took 2 years of architecture courses in high school. My freshman year at the University of Illinois, I majored in architecture. I was ready for a change. I left University of Illinois, came to Howard, changed my major from architecture to design. So I am by training an artist. I've been drawing all of my life. And the beautiful thing about artists is that artists have the capacity to see things that aren't there. Artists have the capacity to create things and bring them into existence. So because of my training as an artist, I've learned to view history through the lens of art, and that I can read a book and visualize what the person is talking about. I can see images, I can see shapes. So when I look at things around me, I see them on multiple levels simultaneously. I look at buildings, I could read a building like a person would read a book, right? Because I understand what goes into creating a building and designing a building. So I made my first trip to Egypt in 1980. I made my second trip to Egypt in 1985. And after returning to DC for my second trip to Egypt, I saw the Washington Monument and said, wait a minute, I just saw those in Egypt. And I realized the Washington Monument is called an obelisk, which is a Greek name for an identical object that was created in Egypt that was known as a Tekken. It's the oldest symbol of resurrection. So I began asking questions. Why is there a Tekken in Washington, D.C.? And why has D.C. law mandated that there's no object that can be taller than that structure? So I ask questions, and every question seeks an answer, right? And as I was pursuing answers to the questions that I was asking, that led to the creation of what was originally known as the Afrocentric Tour of Washington, D.C., which I created in 1986. In 2005, I rebranded it Egypt on the Potomac. So that activity will be 40 years next year. And what it consists of is my curiosity leading me to answer the question, why is the Washington Monument the tallest object in Washington, D.C.? And by researching the history of the layout, design, and development of the city, I created the Egypt on the Potomac field trip. And so I discovered that America's founding fathers, many of whom were Masons, had an understanding and appreciation of Kemetic or Nile Valley history and culture. And that Tekken, the Washington Monument, is a 6,000-year-old symbol that represents the resurrection of Asar. The Asar story is the oldest story, the first story of resurrection known to mankind. So when the Masons erected that building, I think around 1880, they actually they named the monument in honor of George Washington for the public perception. But inside of the monument, they actually dedicated to Asar, the first king of Kemet. So information is always presented on multiple levels. And so my interest is in drilling down into the deeper levels of the presentation of anything. So Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution set aside an area no larger than a 10-mile square that was to serve as the capital of the United States of America. First capital was in New York, then it moved to Philly, then it was in Delaware, then it was at multiple locations. And these white men decided that they needed to create a permanent seat of government for the United States. George Washington was charged with the responsibility for determining where that new seat of government was going to be. George Washington was, in many respects, the Donald Trump of his day. He brokered deals with people who own land in Maryland and people who own land in Virginia on the east and west banks of the Potomac River. And so he had them sell their land to the government at an inflated price. And once that 10-mile square on the east and west bank of the Potomac River was identified, then they came in and bought plots of land at a reduced rate and then sold those plots of land to the federal government at an inflated rate, right? So that's how Washington, D.C. came to be created, but also a 10-mile square. A square is important because squares in Masonry are foundations upon which men's lives are transformed. So it makes sense that since America was established by men who were practitioners of the craft, white men who studied African knowledge, and they used that African knowledge to lift themselves up out of poverty, out of ignorance. So they practice African principles without identifying them as African. And they use those principles to create what has become the wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history. So that's why you have African symbols on the front and back of the dollar bill. That's why you have an African symbol in the geographical center of the capital of the wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history. So when I began to identify those symbols as African or as Kemetic or Nile Valley symbols, because I made a mistake when I wrote the Browder file and said that the pyramid on the back of the dollar bill was an Egyptian pyramid. I didn't realize until I went to Kush in 2016 that it's a Kushite pyramid. The angle of the Kushite pyramid is steeper than the angles of the Kemetic pyramid, which means that in 1778, I believe is the date that they created the symbols on the Great Seal. Whoever those people were, they knew something about Kushite history, right? And they knew the power associated with symbols. They knew the power associated with numbers. So they were very, very strategic about creating this nation with 13 colonies, right? They're very strategic about placing African symbols, surrounding themselves with African symbols so that they could be empowered by the energy that is transferred, that is conducted through those symbols. DC is in shape of a square. The square is aligned to the 4 cardinal points of the compass. Asar's monument sits in the geographical center of that square. The main street that runs from the monument up to the northern point of the square is 16th Street. 16th Street is the spiritual corridor of Washington, D.C. 16th Street is the avenue of churches. You have more churches on that 7-mile stretch of land than any other 7 miles in the United States of America. You got 2 Masonic temples on that street. So the use of architecture.
You already pay rent, utilities, and your phone bill. Why not let those everyday bills help build your credit? Payment history.
Sacred science is embedded in the landscape of Washington, D.C., and all they did was copy the use of sacred architecture that was used in Kemet, all throughout Kemet, specifically in Waset, or the city that's now known as Luxor and Karnak. So these white men were not original by any stretch of the imagination. They used ancient African knowledge to empower themselves while at the same time enslaving the descendants of those people, stripping them of their historical and cultural memory, and then using them as a free source of labor in order to create the capital which made this nation the powerful nation as it is. Now, I tell you something that I'm just really beginning to understand now, after all of this journey, that I don't think all of this was done solely to disenfranchise African people. I see it as part of a larger plan where Africans were aware that they were going to fall. And so they had to make sure that they would have the tools available to them to rise again at the appropriate time. So certain information had to be buried, certain information had to be hidden in plain sight, so that when the time was right to dig up this knowledge, to dig up these symbols, to dig up this information, you would have it at your disposal, and you can now use it to liberate yourself. So that, as I'm talking about it, it gives further explanation to one of the final scenes in Ryan Coogler's film, Sinners, where Smoke is about to smoke the Ku Klux Klan. So he's got this box with all of these weapons, and he buries the box so that after he finishes sniping and taking out the core group of bad guys, living vampires, people who suck the lifeblood, the money, the energy, the talent out of African people, he then goes and unburies his Tommy gun, and then he smokes the rest of them, right? So I think that's a metaphor for where we are right now. You know, this Klan consciousness that has reclaimed the White House and that are very open in their arrogant moves to make America hate again. They're destroying this environment. And I've come to realize that there are African men and women in the midst of all of this who are unearthing certain treasures that have been buried right in their own backyard. And we're using those tools to free our minds and ultimately free ourselves. And it makes sense that this is happening at this point in time now, which is the 100th anniversary of Arthur Schomburg having written an article called "The Negro Digs Up His Past," right? And we are literally and figuratively digging up our past and finding the tools that we can use to liberate ourselves. So if you think in terms of Schomburg wrote that article in 1925, and a 10-year-old John Clark read that article, and that inspired him to jump on a freight train and travel up to Harlem to meet Arthur Schomburg. And with all of his youthful ignorance and arrogance, he demanded Schomburg teach him everything he knew. And Schomburg just laughed and said, "Boy, go and learn about your enemy. Study your enemy, then study yourself. Then study the world that your enemy created, and then come back to me with that knowledge so that we can have an intelligent discussion." So in terms of young folk who are just discovering me and the information that has been poured into me, be like the young Clark and want more, but also be like the young Clark and listen to the information that's being imparted. Don't jump out there and try to do these things before you're ready. Read, study, process what you've read and studied. Learn how this information is applicable in different phases of your life, right? In different places in the world. And once you've gained that knowledge, once you've mastered that knowledge, then come and sit at the feet of someone who can now teach you what you're now ready to learn. Because before, you weren't ready. It would have been like pouring water in a glass that's already full. So you have to be willing to submit to the process. You have to be willing to be patient. You have to be willing to do the work. There are no shortcuts. YouTube and TikTok are not going to teach you what you need in order to live to be 75 years old, 80 years old. You know, you have to learn patience. You have to learn wisdom. You have to learn when to speak and when to shut the hell up, right? Those are skills that are not being taught to a generation who need to master those skills now, because the world is changing so dramatically and so quickly that when this technology that is all you know is no longer accessible to you, you're going to have to come face to face with your real self. And rather than freaking out, you're going to have to step up. You're going to have to woman up. You're going to have to man up and tap into that ancestral intelligence that has always been inside you, waiting for you to humble yourself and be still. Stop bragging, right? And listen to the voices of reason that can get you through this difficult period so that you can get on the other side and be of service to those who are going to need your wisdom in the generations to come and the lifetimes to come. So you got to see yourself as part of a continuum. Your life is not just about this life. It's not just about what's happening right now, what you have right now. It's about all the lives that you lived prior. It's about all the lives that you're going to live in the future, and how all of those lives live in the present. So what you do now will determine the fate of all of those lives. And when you understand how truly precious and valuable your life is, you won't waste it doing foolish things, engaging in activities that will not benefit you 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Activities that will only hold you back and cause you unnecessary regret.